Hello, QVS AP US History students. I hope you are having a good week, and I wanted to take the opportunity today to talk to you about Essential Unit 4, Week 3. We are moving even deeper into the time period from 1800 to 1848, or often referred to as the period of the early republic. There were a lot of changes in the United States at this time. One of the most important or valuable features about the U.S. Constitution was that it allowed for change. So, within the context of the articles, there are 7 articles in the Constitution. The founding fathers wrote in the ability to change that document. So, as we refer to it, it's often called a living document. And those changes were necessary. They understood that as time passed, if the country was going to sustain itself, then inevitably the political document that acts as the foundation of the country would have to allow for those changes. So early in the period, we see a couple changes almost immediately made with the 11th and 12th Amendment, and we kind of looked at that in past weeks. And what we're going to look at in week 3 of this time period is the idea of reform or change. So what we see in the 1800s, particularly prior to the Civil War, were great efforts for reforming society. One of the items that we looked at in the very beginning of the unit was the preamble to the U.S. Constitution, where it references the point of perfectibility in order to make a more perfect union. So really what a lot of these organizations or groups or movements in this period in time were looking for were to perfect upon what had already been established within the context of the United States. We'll take a look at several different reform movements. They are listed under week 3. What we see kind of coinciding with the market revolution is a second great awakening. So whenever there's a period in U.S. history when consumerism is high and there is this sense of like materialism over spirituality, what we often see in the United States is this revival of religious belief. So there was a second great awakening in the United States in the 1820s and 1830s. We see the organization of new belief systems, all within the context of Christianity. So I suppose new like sects of Christianity, even the origins of Mormonism are found in the United States at this time. So in the Second Great Awakening, that is really important for the United States as it coincides with that market revolution. We'll also take a look at women's reform. So there were women were very active at this time in many of the different reform movements, whether it be for women's suffrage. The women's movement began in great momentum at this time. You probably are familiar with the name Susan B. Anthony. However, few people are ever really familiar with the name Elizabeth Cady Stanton. However, she was very famous in the context of American history. She was instrumental at Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 as she penned the female Declaration of Independence, and it kind of like follows along the Declaration of Independence. And instead of all of the grievances being targeted toward George III, the he's that she references in her Declaration of Independence relates to man and the aggressions toward women. So the women's rights movement begins with great momentum and continues on actually after the Civil War, because women don't get the right to vote until the 19th Amendment is passed in 1920. So what we're going to see in many instances, these reform movements that begin prior to the Civil War extend far past the period of 1861 to 1865. However, there is one movement that also has a lot of momentum in that time period before the Civil War, and that was the Abolitionist Movement. So it's important for you to know figures like William Lloyd Garrison. He wrote an abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator, and Frederick Douglass, who actually began working with Lloyd Garrison and his newspaper, but then he split off and broke apart. Frederick Douglass is very famous in the context of U.S. history. He led the abolitionist movement, created his own newspaper called the North Star, and was very outspoken in terms of the anti-slavery movement. He was an escaped slave. His story is actually very interesting if you had time to read his autobiography, because you get to really get a sense of what it was like for African Americans in bondage, and that whole process of escaping to the north and then finding safe haven there, but never really finding a sense of like security or freedom, because what begins to happen in the United States, especially in the 1850s, and we'll kind of look at this in the next unit, is a strict fugitive slave law is put in place. So it was actually dangerous for African Americans who were living in the North, and the potential for them being sent back into slavery in the South was very high, very extreme. That's why a lot of African Americans, when they escaped and used the Underground Railroad in order to get to the North, oftentimes they went to Canada, where they found safe haven there. So the abolitionist movement is another one of the reform movements. I mentioned women's rights, prison reform, and educational reform. So within the context of education, Horace Mann was an important figure. You know, there was always this sense of the importance of public education in a republic. So you have to teach students strong civic values if they're going to contribute effectively and become a part of the voting citizenry. So that idea was always there, and they expanded access to public education at this time and under kind of the ideas of Horace Mann. With prison reform, you'll take a look at a woman named Dorothea Dix. This is hugely important because even going back to the period of the Constitution, we think about to what extent is prison for punishment versus rehabilitation. And this is an important point, especially because if you look at how a lot of people who had mental illnesses were treated at that time, oftentimes they were placed in prison, but they had really never committed any criminal acts. So there's a large movement toward reforming American prisons and kind of considering and discussing whether prison is about rehabilitation and getting people back into society. So you'll take a look at that one. On top of that, another movement, the temperance movement. So alcoholism was a big problem in the United States at this time. There's an interesting article that talks about the per capita consumption rates of Americans in alcohol, hard alcohol, in the 1820s and 1830s. I think it was like 7 gallons per person per year, which is a huge amount. And the whole idea was it impacted productivity, it impacted domestic violence. So there was a strong movement to ban the consumption of alcohol. This does eventually come to fruition, but again, like the women's movement, it does not become a constitutional amendment until the 18th Amendment is passed in 1918, and the United States does experience like a decade-long period called Prohibition. So that is another instance where my point is emphasized that a reform that began at this time didn't really see any legislative change until later on. The one reform movement that does see legislative change early on, though, is I'll kind of go back to that abolitionist movement, because there are constitutional amendments that are added after the Civil War, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment. So we're not really going to get into those in this unit. You'll have to pay attention till the next unit when we start looking at the Civil War to really learn about how those changed American society. But let's take a look at the course page really quick so that I can kind of show you around and talk more about specifically related to the course page and what you have to do this week. So let's go over to the course page. And here is week 3. We begin with the topic, the development of an American culture. I chose two important writers out of American history. Thoreau and Emerson, they were part of a movement of thinkers called transcendentalists. And two pieces that I'm going to have you look at there were called Self-Reliance and On Civil Disobedience. And I think they kind of really get into the heart of like how that American identity was forming, especially like self-reliance. In fact, both of them, but especially Emerson's self-reliance, because if you think of the name alone, it kind of speaks to that sense of like rugged individualism that was needed in order for people to move into the Western frontier. Also, too, on top of that, like on civil disobedience, like I would reference this one more as it relates to the next unit, where Thoreau challenges people to kind of question laws that are not really like justified. So like the whole idea with wars that the American government gets involved in, and the notion of conscription and people's integrity related to their stance on war. I think that's an interesting article too, but collectively, again, both of them kind of contribute ideas to what it meant to be American. On top of that, also that cult of domesticity. So as women were moving to become more politically active, what they were up against were these 4 attributes that kind of like defined the true woman of the 19th century: purity, piety, domesticity, and oh, I'm forgetting the last one. Oh, submissiveness. So that's a great piece there, because then you kind of see the again, the opposition to reform in terms of women taking a more active role in society. And then there's an activity on the Second Great Awakening. And then this whole series of activities here in the Age of Reform. I mentioned all of these before. You're going to have like one big note sheet, and then you use this one big note sheet to gather information from each of these. Although I didn't mention utopian communities, it's interesting the varied different groups that sprout up in the 19th century. They had some very radical ideas of how society should be organized. You'll learn a little bit about them within the context of that activity there. And then in the latter half of the week, we get into a closer look at African Americans in the early Republic and Southern society at this time period. So you can see that there's 4 different activities on slavery in America. You'll take a look at Harriet Brent Jacobs and this life of an escaped slave, and how slavery was like a double burden for African American women. You'll look at a historical analysis here. I'm going to have you read Zinn. He has a great chapter on slavery in America. And then we get into taking a look at the Southern society. So I put together a whole set of documents here for you to take a look at a whole bunch of different aspects of the institution of slavery, even from the economic perspective in cotton production. Cotton was king at this time period, and it was really what was driving many of the plantations, and we see a major increase in the enslaved population. In fact, you saw that in week 2 when you did that activity on demographics. So in a nutshell, that is what we're looking at this week. It is week 3 of Essential Unit 4. We will move into week 4 next week, and of course that entails like your notes, putting together your notes, and doing the progress check on my AP. So really try to push to keep on pace this week with all of the activities that I have outlined there. You probably could borrow a day or two next week, but I want to make sure that you have enough time for the test. And you'll say, well, what a bit about the extra week? But we're going to do some test prep stuff in that week. So have a good week and